Mark Cammack has a long history in Indonesia. He served a mission there. He graduated from BYU in Asian Studies in 1980. He then received a law degree at University of Wisconsin. He was a Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia in 1984-1985. He then worked in the District Attorney's Office in New York, which may not have given him a lot of experience with Indonesia, but he joined the law faculty of Southwestern University in 1990. He teaches courses on criminal procedure, evidence, and comparative law. In his comparative law class, he spends a significant amount of time talking about Islamic law, and he's continued his research interest in Indonesia. I've been fortunate to be able to work with him on projects looking at ways the Indonesian government has attempted to restructure the family by changing laws and procedures regarding age of marriage, divorce, and family planning. These days, we think of Muslims, I think the first thing that comes to some people's mind is a terrorist, but I think Mark today can give us a much more basic understanding of legal and national issues facing this nation that has the largest Muslim population in the world. So, Mark Cammack.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. As Tim said, I'm a graduate of BYU. I was a student here back in the days when the football team got the respect that it really deserves. But I now teach at a law school in Southern California where they have a different dress code, so I have to come into compliance with that. I'm actually not going to talk about the research that Tim and I have been doing together. It's a related topic, but I'm not going to talk about changes in the shape of the family. That's a very interesting topic in its own right. I'm one of those who's of the view that any academic worth the title these days should be able to turn any topic into a talk about the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September the 11th. So that's what I'm going to talk about in some sense. What I'm going to talk about is Indonesian Islamic Inheritance Law. And when I told my wife yesterday as I was leaving Los Angeles that that's what I was going to talk about, she had two responses. Her first was, what makes you think anybody will be interested in that? And her second was, at least you better have some pictures. So I scrambled around and came up with something at least to show you, basically just maps. And I'm going to spend some time trying to convince you that inheritance law in Indonesia has some relevance to those of us in the United States. I'm going to do two things to try to convince you of that. First of all, I'm going to talk about why we might want to be interested in Indonesian Islam more generally, and assuming I can persuade you of that, spend some time talking about Islamic law and what Islamic law has to say about Indonesian Islam. I should emphasize, I suppose, that I teach in a law school, and so while we've been doing research on the forces that are behind some fairly dramatic changes in Indonesian family organization, most of that is sociology, and I have relatively little to contribute, but I do teach law, so that's why I'm going to talk about Islamic Inheritance Law. As Tim mentioned, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. We typically think of Islam as a Middle Eastern religion, and it is a Middle Eastern religion in the same sense Christianity is, in that it originated there. But most Muslims now live elsewhere. There are many more Muslims in South and Southeast Asia than there are in the Middle East. Indonesia has approximately 200 million Muslims, which is about 20% of the entire world population. So it's important from the perspective that there's simply a lot of Muslims living in Indonesia. Another reason we might want to be interested is that at least some or a small number of Indonesian Muslims are among those who are determined to cause us in the United States trouble. There were, in the 1980s, fairly large numbers, in the hundreds, of Indonesians who went to Afghanistan to join in the resistance against Soviet rule in Afghanistan. Some of them returned to radicalized by their experience in Afghanistan. And there are now terrorist training camps in Indonesia and a fair amount of evidence that some of those who were involved in planning the attacks in New York and Washington were in fact trained in Indonesia. The headline for this past Sunday's LA Times read that the U.S. presses terror war in 7 nations. One of those 7 nations where we're seeking to track down terrorists or terrorist organizations is in Indonesia. The indictment that was issued in Spain that contains the most detailed public description of the evidence linking the Al-Qaeda organization with the terrorist attacks states that several of those who were involved have links in Indonesia. And there is in Indonesia, why don't you go ahead and, there is in Indonesia a homegrown group called the Laskar Jihad, which means the Jihad Militia, which is, it's simply an armed group that has caused mostly trouble in Indonesia by entering local conflicts on the sides of Muslim, local ethnic conflicts on the sides of Muslims around the country. This is a map of Indonesia. I suppose I didn't need to locate the place for this audience, but as you can see, it consists of a large number of islands stretching from the northwest corner here on the tip of northern Sumatra. This large island to the left here is Sumatra, all the way over to the eastern edge of the country, which is the western half of the island of New Guinea. Many lay people who aren't familiar with Indonesia or international relations are more readily recognize the names of the islands in the country. But it includes some of the more famous islands in the world, including Sumatra, Java, Borneo, New Guinea, Bali. It also includes an island that has recently become 2 separate countries. This little island of the little island down here is portrayed in this map as being all part of Indonesia. They're now, the eastern half of that island is now a separate independent country of East Timor. So that's, there are within Indonesia, as I say, groups that have been promoting a brand of radical Islam, and some of those groups are in fact linked with the attacks on the U.S. So that's my argument that there's some reason to be interested in Indonesian Islam. Now comes the harder part of trying to persuade you to take an interest in Islamic law. There are a couple of reasons. First of all is that the law, Islamic law, is an important part of Islam. Some would say the most important part. Religious knowledge within Islam is basically formulated in terms of a body of legal doctrines and a set of principles by which those legal doctrines are derived from more basic sources. I'm sure that most of you are aware that Islam is based, like Christianity and like Mormonism, on a revelation that was received by Muhammad in the 6th and 7th centuries. Religions develop different methods of making use of their religious knowledge. And Islam, like Judaism, has done that by developing a body of laws. Within the traditions that we're more familiar with, in Protestant Christianity, for example, also based on a divine revelation, the approach has basically been to allow individuals to arrive at their own interpretation of how the revelations are supposed to be applied in their own lives. For example, in the Bible we find prohibitions against premarital sex, for example, and within liberal Protestantism, or with Protestantism in general, I guess nowadays, individuals are permitted to come to their own judgments about how those kinds of religious doctrines are to be interpreted. So that's one technique, that we leave to the individual the decision about how the more general principles, or sometimes more specific principles that are embodied in this divine revelation, the core of the religion, are to be applied in their own lives. Another approach is the one that's reflected in Mormonism and in Catholicism, which is to have a set of religious authorities, a religious hierarchy, which can provide authoritative interpretations and tell its membership, how to interpret the revelation and apply those revelations to their individual lives. For example, we in the Mormon tradition have the word of wisdom, for example. It is a revelation which on its face is less than completely clear as to exactly how it's to be applied, but our religious leaders have provided us with an authoritative interpretation, and that's the one that we feel bound by. So that's one approach, that's the second approach. One is to leave it up to the individual. The second approach is to have a set of religious authorities who are capable of providing authoritative interpretations. The third approach is the one that's followed in Islam, and this is all to the point of explaining to you what Islamic law is. The third approach is to develop a methodology, essentially, a set of rules of interpretation or techniques of interpretation whereby the more general precepts that are contained in the revelation are elaborated and applied to particular situations. The Quran contains, like the word of wisdom, a prohibition. It's actually worded significantly differently, but a prohibition against drinking wine. It says that the drinking of wine is prohibited. The question arose early on in the development of the religion whether that prohibition has application beyond the specific terms that are contained in the Quran. And the way Islam dealt with that problem is to develop techniques for determining how this rule can be applied in other situations. And basically what they did is develop the same kinds of techniques that we use in our legal system, most prominently a system of reasoning by analogy. You try to determine what the core purpose behind the prohibition was, and then figure out whether the reason that underlies this particular rule has application in other contexts. Over the course of a couple of centuries after Islam was founded, a group of religious legal scholars did the hard work of developing the implications of what is contained in the primary sources, the Quran, and most prominently recorded traditions about actions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and those then are recorded in big, thick books that constitute the body of Islamic doctrine. So what Islamic law is basically is a set of doctrines, a set of more or less precisely stated rules or prescriptions about how people are supposed to behave, as well as a methodology or set of interpretive canons by which those who are involved in the tradition decide how the existing rules are to be applied to new circumstances, which is really what law is all about. Law is a body of doctrine supported by some sort of interpretive methodology. So in one sense, the reason the reason law is important to Islam is, in an important sense, Islam is embodied, is found in Islamic law. That's where you discover what it is. In fact, a traditional religious education in Islam is typically training in Islamic law. Students, often at a very young age, will begin learning about both the content of the doctrine and, as they become more advanced, the jurisprudence, the rules of interpretation. A second reason why it is worthwhile to pay some attention to Islamic law is that Islamic law differs from our understanding of law in a couple of important respects. First of all, it's much broader. Islamic law contains a lot of material that you're not going to find in the United States Code. Much of the content of Islamic law deals with subjects that we would recognize as being religious in the literal sense of the word. That is, it deals with prayer, the requirement that Muslims pray 5 times a day, and detailed guidance on how those prayers are to be carried out, and prayers for special occasions, rules about how one prepares oneself to pray, and how under certain circumstances that preparation can become ineffective. So there are lots of detailed rules that deal with specific religious practices, prayer and fasting and alms and the pilgrimage that I'm sure you've all heard of. Second category of rules deals with another topic that is not ordinarily considered to be part of our law, which is rules about what might be referred to as simply social etiquette, how people should behave in various types of social interactions. This includes a dietary code, some rules that limit interaction between males and females, a dress code for some people, and some more obscure kinds of rules. For example, there's a rule which says that when you walk into the bathroom, you should always enter left foot first, because there's this belief that both left hand and the left foot are less sacred, I suppose. So they have all these detailed rules about how one is supposed to behave. Again, the kind of thing that is not ordinarily treated in our legal system. But finally, Islamic law also includes rules that we would now regard as being the exclusive subject of state regulation. There are rules about marriage, divorce, inheritance, punishment for crimes, commercial transactions, a whole range of things that within our society are the exclusive domain of the state. The existence of those broader rules reflects the fact that throughout much of Islamic history, and for many Muslims today, there's not this recognized distinction between temporal authority and religious authority. That is, those people who have authority over our religious life also have authority over more secular topics, which is why there is not this distinction between rules that govern religious behavior and rules that govern more temporal secular subjects. A second reason why Islamic law is different, and this is perhaps the most important reason why we might want to be interested in it, is that Islamic law is based on a different understanding of both where rules come from and the basis of their authority than is law within our system. That's perhaps an obvious point, but it's also very important. For us, law is really inseparable from the government, from the state. We identify something as being a law, as having the force of law, only by showing that the state has the power to back it up. And in order for something to qualify as a law, you've got to show that it has its source in some lawmaking organ of the state, through legislation, or sometimes through the Constitution, or occasionally through executive regulation or judicial interpretation. But in any event, anything, in order to qualify as a law, must be able to identify its source in some part of the state apparatus. Islam, of course, is based on an entirely different understanding of where law comes from. According to Islamic law, binding legal rules come from God. And in fact, that's the whole point of the methodology of Islamic law, is to show how the specific rules that people are expected to abide by are in fact commanded by God. The methodology shows how the revelation contained in the Quran necessarily implies that people have to abide by these more specific behavioral prescriptions. So not only do many Muslims believe that law must come from God, but also take the view that law can come from nowhere else, that the state has no power to prescribe laws, that God alone has that authority. And that's where the real potential problem arises. In an important sense, the existence of an organization like Al-Qaeda is explainable by reference to these ideas about Islamic law. We've been told over and over again by our political leaders and repeatedly by CNN that we're at war. And yet there hasn't been any formal declaration of war. And the basic reason for that is that the enemy that we're supposedly at war with is not the right kind of enemy. And it's not the right kind of enemy because it doesn't qualify as the kind of opponent that our theory of international relations says we're allowed to be at war with. The basic theory of international relations says that the actors on the world stage are states. And I was going to just show you a picture of a map. I think you're going to have to skip a couple here, Tim. But this is just we can skip that. A map like any other political map, which is intended simply to illustrate how we understand the members of the world community. These lines that divide the planet up into these neatly blocked out units are the definition of the reach of some state's authority. And the foundation of the whole system of international law and international relations is based on the notion that these states alone have the power to exercise force against their populations. And that authority to legitimately exercise force is derived from a concept of national sovereignty, which says that that power belongs to the state, and no organization that is not a part of the state has the legitimate authority to exercise legitimate power within the state's boundaries. Islam is based on a different understanding of the source of legitimate authority and defines a different kind of political community. The next map is intended to illustrate that. For at least some Muslims, the relevant political community is not defined in terms of a national community. In fact, there's an explicit rejection of the notion of the whole principle of nationalism, but should be defined in terms of all those who are subject to Islamic law. And again, the basic distinction between these two notions has its source in theories about where law comes from. One theory says law comes from the states, and that theory divides the world up into a group of precisely defined national units. Another theory says that law comes from God, and that creates a different political community, which is defined in terms of all those who are subject to God's law as a result of the fact that they're Muslims. As I mentioned, Al-Qaeda is in some sense a manifestation of this other political theory. The members of Al-Qaeda come from a variety of different nationalities, including, as we now learn, from the United States. And these people associate themselves together not on the basis of their common national identity. It's a kind of a state in the sense that it's a military organization, claims the right to exercise power, but it derives that claim not from the ordinary principles of international relations, but from doctrines that have their source in Islam, in religion, and Islamic law. Okay, so that's my effort to try to persuade you why you might want to be interested in Islamic law. That it is really, in some sense, the essence of what Islam is. It's the embodiment of Islam, and it also includes within it, at least, some doctrines that create the potential to be a challenge to the way we ordinarily organize our ideas about international relations. What I'm going to talk about now is Islamic law in Indonesia. And the reason, now I've got to try to explain what this has got to do with anything else. The basic what this research does is it tries to sort of take the temperature of Islam in Indonesia to try to determine what the character of Indonesian Islam is, and one way to do that is to look at how the rules are actually being applied. I'm going to have to hurry here if I'm going to do this, though. Indonesia has never applied the Islamic law in the strict kind of way that it has recently been applied in Afghanistan, but has for a long time applied rules governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance. The state has actually enforced doctrines that have their source in Islam for Indonesian Muslims. But there's long been a sense that some of these rules don't really fit very well. Islamic law developed in 7th century Arabia, and it reflects the values and practices of the place where it developed. One of the characteristics that results from its origins is that it's a strongly patriarchal kind of set of rules. Patriarchal in the sense that legal, social, and political rights are generally given to men and not women. That hasn't gone over very well in other parts of the world, including Indonesia, partly because Indonesian social life has generally accorded a good deal more autonomy to women than is common in the Arab societies of the Middle East. One of the rules that has been felt to be especially unjust is a rule of inheritance, which gives female heirs, daughters, a share that is twice as large as the share that goes to a son. So if a person dies and his estate is divided according to the rules of Islamic law, dies with an estate of $30,000, for example, his estate is divided according to the rules of Islamic law. The son gets $20,000, the daughter gets $10,000. The son's share is exactly twice as large as the share of the daughter. This rule probably was felt to be not only just but perhaps generous in the early days of Islam when it developed under the pre-Islamic Arab society. Women had even fewer legal rights than they do under Islamic law. But in places like Indonesia, which don't have that same sort of patriarchal tradition, patriarchal social structure, and also in a modernizing society where ideas from outside of the country about that social or the gender relations and gender rights should be more equalized is felt to be especially inappropriate. So there's been some effort in Indonesia to try to reform the rule, to try to change it in order to equalize the rights of sons and daughters, male and female heirs. And the history of those efforts provides us with some insight into the character of Indonesian Islam. It tells us something about how open the tradition is to change. And the distinction here, again, is one that is probably familiar, and I feel a little embarrassed bringing it up. But it really raises the question of the extent to which Indonesian legal thinking, Islamic legal thinking, is fundamentalist. That's the label that's been attached to the bad guys in this whole story. And what we mean by a fundamentalist, within Islamic law at least, is someone who adheres to a certain approach to the interpretation of the legal authorities. Fundamentalism as a general concept was developed in the United States among American Protestants, and it refers to a religious movement that is intended to return to the original sources, to the fundamentals of the religion. What that means within Islam is a return to the original sources of the law, which generally means commitment to a strict literal adherence to the letter of the Quran without recognition of any possibility of reinterpretation. So the fundamentalists would take the view that those rules or those prescriptions which are contained in the Quran must be followed literally without any adaptation to local circumstances. Another group advocates some reinterpretation to make the rules more amenable to contemporary circumstances. And within Indonesia, there's been a significant debate over whether there is a possibility of changing these rules regarding inheritance in order to make them more fitting to Indonesian society. There was a proposal made in the 1980s to equalize male and female shares, in essence to do away with the inequality that has long been a part of Indonesian Islamic inheritance. That generated enormous controversy, and in the end it failed. The reformers' argument was based on the notion that it's permissible to that we can take these rules that are contained in the Quran and look at the values that lie behind them, and then apply those values to contemporary circumstances. So they look to the fact that within Islamic law, women are granted an inheritance of some sort. They argued then that the limitation shouldn't be interpreted to constitute the maximum share that women are entitled to, but should be seen as a floor, and that in order to apply this broader principle in contemporary Indonesian circumstances, men and women should receive the same share. The effort ultimately failed. The so-called fundamentalists, who insisted on a strict literal interpretation, ultimately won out. A reform or a law was passed, but instead of granting greater inheritance rights to women, it simply codified the Quranic rule, which says the shares of women are half those of men. So what does this all mean? One important point, I think, and probably the most important point, is that there is a debate. Islamic law is often sort of stereotyped as being entirely fixed and rigid and completely incapable of any sort of adaptation, and that's certainly not true. There is a lively debate in Indonesia about how Islamic law is to be applied, and there are those who take the view that significant reinterpretation is possible in order to make it a modern sort of legal system within a modern nation state. There are also those who, and they, at the moment at least, are strong enough to prevent any kind of change, who insist on this principle that there is absolutely no room to to move beyond the strict literal text of the law. In some sense, what is going on here? One question that this really raises is how important all this is again, and I think there's a question whether these people are actually motivated by their attachment to these rules, or they serve some other purpose in their lives. And it's more likely, I think, that debates about Islamic law have less to do with the actual division of people's property and a good deal more to do about how people deal with their changing social circumstances. Places like Indonesia are in the process of very rapid social change, and it causes a good deal of anxiety. One of the ways people find some element of certainty in these kind of rapidly changing social circumstances is attachment to religious traditions that provide them with some sense of certainty. And fundamentalism is, in my view, in large part a response to the fact that people find it extremely upsetting, and this sort of strict adherence to something that they can hold on to as being a point of sort of certainty and absolute truth is a refuge against those kinds of social change. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
Salt Lake City is the center of Mormonism, and Rome is the center of Catholicism. Where does this hierarchy, where is the center of the Muslim world?
Well, there isn't really a center. That's part of. There isn't a center, and there is a center in the sense that there are sacred sites. You've probably heard that Muslims, when they pray, face towards Mecca. But there's no center in the same sense that Rome is the center of Catholicism and Salt Lake the center of Mormonism, because there's no religious hierarchy. There's no system of religious authorities. There's no church. They're just local units, and so it doesn't really have any center in the same sense by any means. Yeah.
You talked about the status of women concerning poverty and some of the changes that were made, but what is the actual status of not only concerning inheritance, but rights and social rights? And I mean, it's famous what is the Islamic law, but can you be more specific?
Well, there are really two questions there, I think. One is, what legal rights does Islamic law give to women, and the second question is to what actual social rights do women exercise within Islamic countries. And both of those, you can give different answers to both those questions. As I was trying to suggest, interpretations of Islamic law are really being disputed. That is, there are different interpretations of Islamic law, and some grant women greater social rights than others. A lot of what is happening in Indonesia revolves around the question of whether women should be granted greater legal rights. And one of the changes that Tim and I have looked at is change in divorce rules. Under classical Islamic family law, men could divorce their wives without even telling them. They didn't have to go to court. They didn't have to prove any reasons for the divorce. They simply had to say, I divorce you, and that just uttering that formula had the effect of terminating the marriage. Well, Indonesia has done away with that rule, or attempted to do away with that rule, and give women divorce rights that are more or less equal to the rights possessed by men. And Indonesia has never had the tradition of, for example, requiring that women cover themselves when they go out. It's now becoming more common, but historically, women didn't follow the tradition that's found in some Middle Eastern countries of covering them. They're not restricted in the ways that women in some parts of the Middle East, they drive, they have professions. Yeah. No, well, it's too early for there to have been any legislation. She's been in an awkward position. It's true that she was opposed by these more fundamentalist groups, but in order to, her vice president is one of the more fundamentalist guys around, and he made some very inflammatory statements about the U.S. after the attacks in September. She, feeling the pressure from Muslim groups, has been less than fully supportive of the U.S. They've refused, for example, to freeze assets of groups that are potentially affiliated with terrorist organizations. It's hard to say how her presidency is going to change things. She certainly does not come from the Muslim wing of Islamic politics, but she can't ignore those groups, and the fact that she doesn't have the kind of authority that her predecessor does makes it much harder for her to try to deal with those groups. Yeah.
You said that the Muslim law precisely states how one should behave in situations, but yet a lot of my teachers emphasize over and over again that Islam is a religion of peace, but you talk about fanatics as being strictly follow the law, but yet they don't seem to be very peaceful.
Well, that's a good point. There are people who know a great deal more about this topic than I do who pointed out that the terrorist activities are find no support within Islamic law. But they nonetheless claim to be adherents of these schools of thought which are based on the notion that one must abide by strict interpretation of Quranic provisions. But you're absolutely right that there is no support within Islamic law for their terrorist activities. That's absolutely right.
Yesterday there was a report carried widely that some Taliban fighters in Afghanistan happened upon some Afghanis who had shaven their beards, 5 of them, I believe. They proceeded to cut their ears and noses off because they had transgressed that particular understanding. Now, I'm not enough of a Quranic scholar or Sharia scholar whether or not a beard is required, or just how far out on a limb are these guys going, or is this some other kind of a political problem?
Well, I'm sure it's some other kind of a political problem, but I am also I'm not really versed in the rules regarding. There's been this long tradition that devout Muslims grow a beard, which has been a real problem in Indonesia because they don't have any facial hair. So, and I'm not sure where that comes from. There are provisions in the Quran that address dress, but most Muslims outside of South Asian and Southeast Asian Muslims have interpreted those much differently than they have in the Middle East. Indonesian women have, in many parts of Indonesia, dressed in ways that we would find immodest. So they're definitely subject to different interpretation. But I don't think there's a very strong basis in any part of the Islamic legal tradition for these kinds of things that you're talking about. Well, thank you. I know that you all have to go to class, so thank you.
Yeah. We go way back. We go way, way back.
There's been a dramatic shift in power since
probably not